My name is Paul Casey, and you're very welcome to our online Winter Warmer Festival being streamed from Cork. And I'm very excited to introduce our featured guests this evening and to extend a warm welcome to Jean Boase-Beier, to Mary O'Malley, and to Sinead Morrissey. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to introduce our guests in order, and then at the end we'll have a short Q&A. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Jean Boase-Beier, writer and editor of poetry and an academic writer. She is Professor Emerita of Literature and Translation at the University of East Anglia, where she founded the MA in Literary Translation in 1992 and ran that until 2015. Her academic work focuses on translation, style and poetry, and especially on the translation of Holocaust poetry. Jean is translations editor for ARC Publications, while her own poetry translations are all from ARC, include collections by modern German poets Ernst Meister, Rose Ausländer, and Volker von Törne. And so I just need to shout out to ARC Publications because they are one of our festival partners, and thanks to them we've had many exciting guests over the years. So please give a warm welcome, virtual welcome, to Jean Boase-Beier.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me as well. I'm going to be reading translations, as you've heard, of the German poet Volker von Törne, and he won't be a familiar name to most people, so I'll just tell you a little bit about him before I start. And you can see his book there. Volker von Törne was born in 1934, and he was 5 when the Second World War started, so he was 11 when it ended. So his childhood was largely spent during the war. His father was a Nazi, he was in the SS and was killed during the war. And as a result of this, von Törne suffered from a feeling of guilt for all his life. He did become quite an important post-war poet in Germany, though not one of the most famous, perhaps. And he believed that you had to tell people what had happened, and you had to admit guilt. That was really important. You, as a German, you had to admit guilt for what had happened. And he gave lots of lectures and went on lecture tours and worked so hard that his health was not that good. And he basically worked himself to death, and he died in 1980 when he was only 46. And a lot of his poems are about telling people what went wrong and why he feels guilt about it. I'd just like to say that I started the translations of these poems many, many years ago with my co-translator, Anthony Vivis, who died in 2013. And then I continued to work on it after that. And as you might have seen, the book is published by ARC, and I think Paul said. The first poem is, I'm going to give you a little bit of context for each poem because this poet will be unknown to you most probably. So in the first poem I'm going to read, von Törne says a little bit about himself and basically tells his story. And if anybody knows the poems of Bertolt Brecht, you might possibly recognize influences of Brecht and other poets. The first poem, Thoughts in May. I speak of myself, Volker von Törne, born in the 34th year of the 20th century, while my comrades were fighting the murderers who brought me up as their own in their image. And I drank the milk denied to the starving, and I wore the clothes stolen from my brother, and I read the books justifying the theft, and I listened to speeches inciting to murder, and I called that slaughterhouse my fatherland, while the nations took up arms against my nation. And I prayed for the murderers for their final victory, while the cities went up in flames. And mine was the guilt for the loss of every life, breathing in innocence under the gallows branches of the sweet-smelling limes. I'm going to read you that poem in German as well, just so you get a sense of the German. Gedanken im Mai. Ich rede von mir, Volker von Törne, geboren im 34. Jahr des 20. Jahrhunderts, als meine Genossen schon kämpften gegen die Mörder, die mich aufzogen, als ihresgleichen nach ihrem Bilde. Und ich trank die Milch, die dem Hungernden fehlte, und ich trug das Kleid, meinem Bruder geraubt, und ich las die Bücher, die den Raub billigten, und ich hörte die Reden, die aufriefen zum Mord. Und ich nannte den Schlachthof mein Vaterland, als schon die Völker aufstanden gegen mein Volk. Und ich betete für den Endsieg der Mörder, als schon die Städte aufgingen im Rauch. Und schuldig war ich am Tod jedes Menschen, ahnungslos atmend unter den Galgenästen süß duftende Linden. The second poem I'm going to read is one that describes his traveling. He traveled, as I said before, he traveled about a lot, and he believed that you should try to undo some of the ill effects of fascism in other countries. And so he traveled to countries in Europe and beyond Europe, telling people about the evils of fascism and also trying to help rebuild. So in practical terms, rebuilding bridges and that sort of thing. He was one of the directors of an organization called in German Aktion Sühnezeichen, or Action Reconciliation Services for Peace in English. It still exists, and it still does similar work with getting people together and meeting and talking about what it was that led to the rise of Nazism. And he's sometimes characterized, von Törne is sometimes characterized as a Christian communist. And he probably would have seen himself in those terms, but he's very careful in this poem to refuse to be seen as a religious figure. He thinks more that it's about not about doing good so much as trying to make reparation for evil. On paths of ashes. Above the church tower, the summer once seemed an angry angel with flaming sword. In the branches a jay screamed. The cows in their stalls bellowed out, and the bread in the oven was burned. The pear tree blossomed white. The sun broke through a fiery wind from the clouds. Then I followed the smoke signals, traveling far across country, by rivers, through flooding grass. I felt the rush of the sky through my lungs. Behind me, the gardens sank down into dusk. The forests perished in smoke and fire, and I forgot to count the crows on the roadside. There was no voice calling me over the waters. There was no dove descending to rest upon me. The night crowned my forehead with wings of bats, and I moved with a tongue that was turned to stone, beneath the unspeaking moon, alone on paths of ashes, buried in the wind. Whatever I say, words like wolves' teeth, more cutting than knives. Whatever I say, open your lips, for I have to drink from your bitter waters, until you close over me, flesh inseparable. I dig myself into earth, where briefly I send down my roots. I'm now going to read a very short poem. A lot of his poems are extremely short, so you have to listen carefully, or it will be finished. He was always very concerned with catchphrases and what they really mean, and that we shouldn't just use phrases unthinkingly. I'll read the German of this one as well, but first the English. Epigram. We Germans, hardworking, respectable, that's why other nations love us, always so good at clearing up. Epigramm. Fleißig sind wir und ordentlich. Deshalb lieben die anderen Völker uns Deutsche. Überall räumen wir auf. Many of his poems describe little incidents that happened or people he met on his travels. And they're often little snapshots of places that bear memories of the past. And the name in the title of this poem is Vasily, which suggests that it's somewhere over in Eastern Europe, possibly Russia. It's a Russian name. Vasily on the road. Vasily, toothless, on the road. Here, on that day, the Germans stood his son against the wall. The white of the wall pierces my eyes. Another poem which describes an incident, possibly an imagined one, possibly a real one. And it's one of the images in it, the image of wolves, is an image that he uses a lot. Possibly, partly it's a conventional image of something that one's afraid of, but also it was an image used a lot by the Nazis. They like to call themselves wolves, and Hitler's hideout was called the Wolf's Lair. He called it that. Hour of the wolves, hour of the wolves, and the songs of the girls in the village fell still. The flight of the dove cut across by the hawk. The swallows transported the light. Voices like calls from away in the darkness. Wind drove snow over the path. And another very short poem. It's very short, but it has a lot in it, and it's concerned with what people say and whether they mean what they say, and whether we can ever know whether they mean what they say. While reading the paper, butchers didn't know of slaughter, so at least the papers say. And I watched my sister with her dolls sewing yellow patches on in play. Another poem which is about phrases and whether phrases whether they mean what people think they mean and whether we shouldn't look at what they really mean. I'm going to read this one in German as well. One of the phrases that occurs in this poem is "the Jews are our misfortune," and this was a phrase much used by the Nazis, but it actually was used before the Nazis. Final solution. The Jews are our misfortune. That's what we've always said, only none of us knew. I'll read that one in German. Endlösung. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. Das haben wir immer gesagt. Das hat keiner gewusst. The next poem is about the Constitution. The Constitution the German Constitution, that is, was formulated in 1949, and it was formulated for West Germany by the Western Allies because Germany was divided up after the war. So the Western Allies, France, the UK, and the US formulated this constitution in 1949, which was later taken over for a unified Germany in 1990, but that was after von Törne's death. So he's writing this poem in 1976, and again, it's ironical about the constitution. Yeah, that's all I need to say, I think. The Constitution, 1976. Both feet firmly planted in the soil of our German Constitution, I make my statement. As it is now, so it will always be. Until the end of time, our basic principles of freedom, and democracy shall hold. Only the communists dare assert that this world is not the best of all possible worlds, and only heretics question whether the sun really revolves around the earth. A poem which is in the form of a drinking song. It's again an ironical poem. It plays around with the idea that sometimes the explanations people offer for what happened in the Second World War and in the Holocaust are not very good explanations. So it's a light-hearted poem, but it's also very ironical. Drinking song. Hitler's life was deadly dull because he drank no alcohol. Later on, this boring man drank more blood than Genghis Khan. If he'd had more taste for ale, we'd not have had this sorry tale. Von Törne sometimes wrote about other victims, because we must remember that although the final solution was, from the Nazis' point of view, getting rid of Jews, it wasn't only Jews who were killed. They wanted to get rid of everybody who was different or was seen as a threat. And in particular, people who were what we might characterize as traveling people. So gypsies, tinkers, the rootless, people who traveled and didn't have a permanent home. They were victims too. And this poem is about them. Smoke. This land was alive once. Green carts made their way through the village. In the first light, horses snorted by the river. Which way have the music makers gone, and the tinkers? On what banks are their horses grazing now? Beneath what moon their violins singing? No one has seen them. Without a trace, smoke in the clouds, they have gone away. Von Törne has several poems called Elegy, but I will read only one of them. It's called Elegy, but it's full of a terrible sense of what the Germans have done to a particular landscape, possibly a landscape that's now in, an area that's now in Poland. Elegy 1. Villages, wind bent in rain, meadows in willow light, the gentle beauty of girls in the evening, a lilac tree over the fence, sweet-smelling snow. This land, wiped out from every atlas, scorched earth, ashes pierced by roots, words thrown like stones into rising waters. The days are growing shorter and the light colder. In my hands, nothing but grief. In my eyes, I gather up the fragments of the sky. I will just read one more poem. This poem is called, it's called Summer in the Masurian Lakes, and the Masurian Lakes of the title are an area which is now in the northeast of Poland, but it was part of Germany until after the Second World War. It's near the Hitler's hideout, the Wolf's Lair that I mentioned earlier, that was his headquarters on the Eastern Front. You see the longing for an untroubled child, or a longing for a memory of childhood, which is not troubled by what you then later find out actually happened while you were a child. And in a sense, the first word gives it away. It shows that this is not just a poem about happy memories. Summer in the Masurian Lakes. Smoke above the house. Speck frying in the pan. Milk on the table, warm from the cow. Sun behind black clouds flying above the forest in the wind. Eagles in the light. The cuckoo heralding whole years of peace. Here I want to stay, sheltered by wood. The road, far away. Across the water, forest shadows slowly move. Among the raspberry bushes, children sing. Thatched roof in alder light. The tree at the well, outlined by sky. The evening, filled with scents of hay and elder. Our boat drifts to the bank. Stay, summer, I shout, hand that holds me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for that beautiful rendition of Volker von Törne's work, for your gorgeous translations, and for introducing us to clearly a very important poet. So I look forward to maybe hearing a little bit more about that later in our Q&A session. Thank you very much. So our next guest that I'd like to introduce to you today is Mary O'Malley. She's from Connemara on the west coast of Ireland and has published 8 books of poetry, and her 9th, Gaudent Angeli, is due out from Carcanet in September, so it is out from Carcanet. Forgive me, I've had this biography for a couple of months. She has won many awards and is published in numerous languages, a member of Aistana. Mary lectured in NUI Galway for many years, the National University of Ireland, and was also awarded the Handbook Chair of Irish Studies. She has held numerous residencies, including in Paris, Tarragona, and the US, and she has been particularly active in environmental education, specifically of the ocean, for over 25 years. So please welcome Mary O'Malley.
Thank you all. Good evening. I'll start with 2 poems about what people know, and just really how people know things. And I suppose the first one is particularly about the attempt to, the destruction of the fishing industry along the west coast of Ireland, and probably a lot of the UK as well. And the contention, I suppose, of the poem is that the people, the small fishermen and small farmers, were in fact the great conservators, and rather than a threat. Atlantica. You get tired of being wild. The crest torn from a wave and wind is an everyday thing. The peregrine on his rock wants to go back to normal life before he was feral or endangered or a raptor. Maybe he liked being just a hawk. You want to go out in your boat and fish without bailiffs arriving to board as if they were the US Navy and you were hiding a catch of immigrants for the black market, making you put out your cigarette. You want to be on the strand in the sun, watching the purplish shifts in a pool at low tide, and not feel ashamed to know every inch of shore, but not the proper names for things, nor all the scientific implications. You know enough. You have to listen to thunder. But even the indifferent sea gets tired of everything being marvelous. It is choking on plastic adjectives, and an insulted sea rises. You know what that means. News. He knows by the horses that are everywhere in the fields, unemployed, their gaze fluent as verses, put aside for years with the rosary beads, and prayers, but lately plentiful again as primrose or furs. By the quick shivers of their skin, he knows they are listening to news that concerns our fate and theirs. And these are from Gaudent Angeli, these poems I'm reading now. and I want to read two poems from a sequence that about Persephone, but they're really they're called myth, and one's called myth and one's called history, taken really from Mythistorema, George Zephyrus's wonderful sequence, or wonderful poem. It's just poems are the poems are really interrogating, I suppose, the myth to some extent. And the myth in this particular case is the myth of Persephone. What we have of them is hearsay, some pictures on vases, a mosaic that could have been anyone, and the stories, more or less alike, go like this. A young woman was gathering flowers when the ground opened, and a man took her, a god. The stories about Demeter's grief, so great it parched the earth, shriveled crops, stopped all growth that brought the gods to the table. The story is stopped all growth that brought the gods to the table. The story is about a mother's love. A young girl is eating pomegranates, their little seeds between her teeth. One stuck. Should she have fasted? For that slip, she got 6 months, year in, year out. Her mother got life, watching her emerging from the dark, eyes hurting, the light x-raying her bones. Soon the girl asked for a wrap of shadow around her. Why? All we have are fragments, rumours. We pick among them for a key to unlock the hieratic texts of our lives, over and over. History. This story is about a mother and a daughter, a god taking what he wanted, Demeter's girl. All we know of them is hearsay, some figures on vases, the woman with her sheaf of corn. Her rage stopped the harvest. Bare shelves brought the gods to the table. This story is about a bargain and a trick, a young girl eating a pomegranate, a seed in her teeth. The girl has no say in our best-known versions. We see her climbing from the dark, eyes hurting, the light x-raying her bones, year in, year out. Demeter might have said, stay if it's easier. Let the crops rot. But the myth needed growth. This is no time for shady business, the bargains and chains. We too live in important places. Let the books remember the local battles. Rewrite the plot. Let the harvest wither. This is your life. She is your great event. Keep her in the sun. And you'll have spotted a reference there to Patrick Kavanagh's wonderful poem, Epic. We have lived in important places. I'll read a couple of poems from Playing the Octopus, and I'll read them in reference poems that deal with time I spent in America trying to figure out the landscape in Pennsylvania. Although I'd been there several times before, I hadn't actually lived there. And what I kept missing was the Native Americans and the original names because of Jin Shanchas and our connections with it here. I couldn't get any grasp on why places were named the way they were, and I kept wondering what the original names of the different places had been, because the landscape is actually very powerful, even if very flat. First visit to Penn's Landing. There's been no sea for months, so the river, a slow tide of gunmetal, provides a link to 200 miles away, and the main coast, with its rock pools and a mermaid, gathering barnacles, and Cal on his legacy. I want them to say I was a heartbreaker. A mermaid with hands torn from the rough shells. Trouble from allergies is de rigueur here, and it could be that the silver in her ring with its single black stone is laced with zinc. The water is icy, too cold, and it stings, but its sting is glorious, and it strikes me as a kind of explanation for the America that is Protestant and white, or the start of one. A training ship, the Gazella, fished for cod in Newfoundland and the cold shores of Greenland, and in the heat of New Orleans she starred in a movie with vampires on board. The river is flat, wide, undammed, and why it should warm me with this small truth in winter, with a taste of hard-won bacalhau, and the drink still standing in a bar in New Orleans unclaimed as the future, is how life's promises reward us for keeping faith, with all the atoms whirling in a word, with the lights in spinning tops. It's why we keep going to the circus with our high wire acts, this chance meeting with the elements of our own makeup floating free. Natives. English is making strange again, contrary as a 2-year-old silence. Irish sticks its tongue out in hard, necessary syllables that spit and hiss, and consonants like shards of nice. English is not the tool for this, but English is what I have. This is no way to map this frozen place. The sharp light cars like barges, the flat, lean grant of William Penn's tamed share, rearing suddenly up 100 floors vertical, but mapping is not what I am at, not sapping, but naming. Where is the voice of the Indian? I hear it in the wind, feel it flense the skin, strip the wire, buckle the ground under the asphalt. The howl of America grown distant, the tense ghosts in street corner faces. A fox cried last night outside our window, for a mate, for food, the native for no. The Ghost Chant. What it is to be a people that live so lightly on the land, their own families named each of them for the simple traits they carried or would inherit as gifts upon becoming grown, to grow up young. What it must be to lose an entire continent to men who traded in baubles and lies, who flourished under false names, and then to see your trails cobwebbed in the moonlight, pale, crossed by ghost caravans. They were stitched between mountains across the river we call Delaware, night raiders, ghost encampments. What I am hunting is the syllables of old names. I hear their echoes in the chant, electrifying the body, drumming, singing the wolf's story. And I wanted to read those because during lockdown, I have, like most people in Ireland, and certainly everybody along where I live and come from, a lot of family and friends in America. And I was very distressed, as were they, to see what was happening. And there was one moment after towards the end of the election where or towards the beginning of the count, after the election, the beginning of the account, where it looked like America might be headed for something very, very dangerous indeed. And I was very relieved when things turned out the way they did. This is called Plague Season, and it's actually in part about lockdown, a metaphor for lockdown, but also, as it happens, I wrote it just on that particular day, 2 days, I think, after the election. It is a hard year, but the rain has paused dramatically like a bad actor. There's no tension, and like a bad actor, it will go on in fits and starts. Only so much can happen in the interval. When we stagger back inside, unreason's monsters rage across the stage again. Titus Andronicus, red in hand, act and part. the one that used to make us laugh before we knew that life is mostly poor theatre, and grotesques are born when reason sleeps. We know the repertoire. 2 Richards, 3 Henrys, King John, and this. What else is history but tragedy and farce, the which depends on point of view and time? The stars are out, and a cold moon dances down the street. Give us the comedies before another downpour starts. And I'll read 2 more. One from Angeli again. And although it's not quite the season for this yet, I think I'll read... No, I won't. I'll read a poem, a Spanish poem, because right through lockdown I have been kept going, and I'm still kept going, by the 2 things. The hope of getting to Paris and the hope of getting to southern Spain, any part of Spain. At this late stage, the gypsy said, I'm going to stake it all on hope, a craft as safe as any other. The last trick in the box, brighter than most, and ditch the old stays and corsets worn too long against despair, around the heart and never worked. It's as raw now as at the hour of birth. I want to taste the red juice of pomegranate, the seeds like baby's teeth, all the sweeter for being brief, and tell the time by water clock. Granada is the place for me. Who knows, on the long way round by sea, I might meet a dolphin or a sunfish or a salmon going home. Then inland, through the bitter hills, where villages perch like brides, waiting to be snatched by boys on vertiginous motorbikes and deflowered willingly in caves. I will keep going, and where I can, sing until I reach the Albaicín and rest and listen to the water laughing in cisterns and dream. And I'll finish with a Christmas poem that I wrote last it's actually not a Christmas poem. It is, I suppose, an essential 6th of January poem, a 12th night poem, really, 12th day. It's from the Cherry Tree Carol, and it's called the Cherry Tree Carol in deference to that wonderful old song, traditional song. And in it, well, I think it's self-explanatory. One of the beautiful things about that particular carol is that the Virgin is very human. The seasons are sort of out of kilter, and she has cravings, the cravings of any pregnant woman might have. I called the kings expecting faded colours, old cardboard men jaded from expectation and travel. Instead, they whirled in the air, turbaned, young, rings flashing ruby and gold. In spite of what they know, they glowed before me for a minute or an hour. Centuries spooled out around them, lures cast from a rod across the flat surface of the trembling elements. I called Mary, pregnant and homeless, in spite of what I know and how it ends. She came to give birth again in a shed warmed by the sharp stink of a wolf's breath or the fug of cattle and ass. It wasn't the birth I wanted, but the story of the strange child in the womb that ordered a cherry tree to bow down low to my mother's knee, to satisfy her gravid craving and ours. In spite of the nails and the lumbering beast, the moon and the stars will sail under his feet, the masked moon and her icy stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for that absolutely gorgeous reading. It's not the first time that I've almost forgotten that I was on duty because I'm falling into the depth of the reading. So thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to hearing more in our Q&A. Thank you. So our next guest is the author of 6 poetry collections. Sinead Morrissey was born in 1972 and grew up in Belfast. Currently, she is the Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle University. Among her numerous awards, Sinead has won the UK National Poetry Competition, the Irish Times Poetry Prize twice, and the T.S. Eliot Prize for her collection Parallax. Her collection, On Balance, was the winner of the Forward Prize for Best Collection 2017 and the European Poet of Freedom Award 2020. So please welcome Sinead Morrissey.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's lovely to be here as part of the Winter Warmer Festival, and we certainly need some winter warming. So on this evening, we can kind of pull ourselves around the digital fireplace of our screens and our laptops and get warmed by poetry. I'm going to read from Find Architecture, which is my new selected poems, and it came out from Carcanet earlier this year. And this is a poem called The Hanging Hare. Once a boy with a bare brown chest brought a hare to our back door. It was heavy summer. The alleyway he walked along held August's thin-lit stink and stupor. He wouldn't stay, declared the hare, a present from his father. My brother fetched a length of string, tied it by its feet, then watched as our mother fastened it carefully to the iron banister where it spun like the spiraling seed of a sycamore, losing momentum. Soon enough, it hung there, motionless, impaled upon its own frozen direct line of perfect martyrdom, its eye an abyss, its foxglove fur unblemished bar the torn and matted abdomen where the shot went in. I could have sat at foot of the flight of stairs for hours to get the measure of it, its ear tips dipped in black against the almost white of its ears' interiors, if my mother had allowed it. She banished me outside, where the afternoon lay festering, and yet it almost seemed as if the sunken playground hacked out stumps of trees and blackened mattresses where a fire had been were wiped out by this gift, this legacy of unimpeded air, of whitethorn quartered fields for miles around, of granular traces still on the skin from a swimmable river, of plovers' eggs, the calyx wheels of larkspur, of spaces where a hare might flourish. Like a sideshow hawker with a star exhibit, I rounded in the street before my father skinned and washed and jugged the hare in blood and butter. Look, I said, to a ring of children and pointed. It's gorgeous. In the great Polish journalist and writer Kapuscinski's kind of travelogue about traveling through the places of the former Soviet Empire, Imperium, he talks about being up in Siberia in what he thought was a very cold day. And he met a child and he said to her, it's very cold today, isn't it? And this child said to him, oh, it's not cold today. It's cold when you breathe out and your breath condenses around your body and leaves your outline kind of hanging in mist. And she said that enabled her to be able to tell who had gone to school before she had, because she could see these kind of ghostly outlines still present in the atmosphere. Shadows in Siberia, according to Kapuscinski, are upright, cast not by sunlight, but by frozen breath. We breathe and are enveloped in an outline, and when we pass, this outline stays suspended, not tethered to our ankles as our sun shadows are. A boy was here, fantastically dressed against the Arctic frost like an heirloom glass in bubble wrap. He has disappeared into the portico of himself. Not even Alice, with her knack for finding weaknesses in the shellac of this world, left so deaf a calling card. Many years ago, I visited Wordsworth's cottage, and I bought a copy of Dorothy Wordsworth's journal, and I'd never read her before. And I was absolutely transfixed by this book and by her incredible writerly talent. And of course, I was struck, as so many other people have been struck, by how much her brother stole from her diary. And, you know, that was kind of the arrangement, and that she would kind of, you know, note down all the raw material, and he would work it up into poetry. But what also struck me about it, apart from her fantastic descriptions and absolute command of the language, was how much she liked to note when William was having difficulty composing. So this poem is in her voice, and I'm just pretending to be Dorothy, really, making different notes on the same day. 1801. A beautiful cloudless morning, my toothache better. William at work on The Peddler. Miss Gell left a basket of excellent lettuces. I shelled our scarlet beans. Walked out after dinner for letters. Met a man who had once been a captain, begging for alms. The afternoon, airy and warm, no letters. Came home via the lake, which was near turquoise and startled by summer geese. The soles on this year's boots are getting worn. Heard a tiny, wounded yellow bird sounding its alarm. William as pale as a basin, exhausted with altering. I boiled up pears with cloves. Such visited evenings are sharp with love. I almost said, dear, look, either moonlight on Grasmere, like herrings, or the new moon holding the old moon in its arms. And I wrote this book for my dear friend Sheila Llewellyn, and she in turn gave me a book. She gave me an extraordinary book called The Moscow Puzzle Book, and it's a book of 153 mathematical recreations. It's a book of mental math problems, essentially, which was a runaway success in the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. And this book is so extraordinary for a number of reasons, one of which is that the maths are very difficult. So, you know, this says quite a lot about the standard of maths education in the Soviet Union in the early 1950s, that people were able to work out these problems in their heads. And the other thing that was kind of so instructive about this book is how much ideology fed into the maths problems. So they would give you something very difficult to work out in your head through a series of sentences, but at the same time they would tell you how to be an ideal Soviet citizen. And I was fascinated by this because, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed so quickly. So this idea that it was going to go on forever and that its truths were such self-evident truths that they belonged in the realm of pure mathematics. You know, all of that just shattered overnight. Puzzle for Sheila Llewellyn. Vitya pledges his brigade of pioneers will plant half as many fruit trees as the other pioneers. Kiryusha pledges his brigade, the best of the detachment, will match the trees of all brigades together, including Vitya's. Their brigades work the last shift simultaneously. The preceding brigades of the detachment plant 40 trees. Both pledges are fulfilled exactly. How many trees does the whole detachment plant? Answer: a kind of Latin, finished and intricate, or a box of glass plate negatives from 1887, unearthed by accident of Newcastle Cloth Market. The oceanic white-tip shark. Ectoplasm. Natasha Ivanova on her collective farm, working out the most efficient way to harvest cotton. And a poem for my son when he was very small. He's not very small anymore, and he's much taller than me now. But when he was a young boy, he would lie awake at night. He wouldn't go to sleep, and I used to ask him why he wasn't able to fall asleep. And we lived on the north shore of Belfast Lough, and he told me that he was waiting for the lighthouse on the Copeland Islands over across near Bangor. He was waiting for that lighthouse beam to become visible, and then he would be able to go to sleep. So I wrote this poem for him. Lighthouse. My son's awake at 10, stretched out along his bunk beneath the ceiling, wired and watchful. The end of August. Already the high-flung daylight sky of our northern solstice dulls earlier and earlier to a clouded bowl. His Star of David lamp and plastic moon have turned the dusk to dark outside his room. Across the loch, where ferries venture blithely, and once a cruise ship, massive as a palace, inched its brilliant decks to open sea, a lighthouse starts its own night-long address in fractured signalling. It blinks and bats the swing ball of its beam, then stands to catch, then hurls it out again beyond its parallax. He counts each creamy loop inside his head, each well-black interval, and thinks it just for him, this gesture from a world that can't be entered, the two of them partly curtained, partly seen, upheld in a sort of boy talk conversation no one else can hear. That private place, it answers, with birds and slatted windows. I've been there. And then to follow with a poem from my daughter, who's also not so small anymore. But this again is when she was about the same age as I wrote that poem about my son, so about maybe 6. And we were driving along in the car when she was about 6. And she suddenly started to tell me the story of my own life. And it was so funny because she's very exuberant, as she told her, but also because she picked out really insignificant bits of my life as massively important and completely ignored, other sort of major developments in my biography. So I just picked up where she began and ran with it. So this is my life according to you. So I was born and was small for ages, and then suddenly a cardboard box appeared with 2 furry black ears sticking out of it. It made me nervous, but I was brave and gave it a bell to play with, and then out it jumped and loved me. It was my cat. I called it Morris Morrissey. It matched my mother's Morris Minor. For the next bit, I was a teenager and then I grew up. I had a flat in Dublin and a boyfriend. He was a vet, little bed, little kitchen, little towel rack, lots of little cups and saucers. And then off he went to Africa. He sent me pictures of giraffes and of the second tallest waterfall in the world. When he got back, he wasn't my friend anymore. I cried for a week. I was also at university, a bigger place than school with bigger chairs and desks. And when it finished, I found a suitcase. It was red with purple flowers. It had a scarf around the handle. I put in everything I needed, socks and a jotter and snacks, and took a plane across the ocean to Japan to visit Godzilla, where it was summer and boiling hot, and the people all kept wind chimes to make it cooler and rode bicycles to the shops and at the same time held up umbrellas though it wasn't even raining. And when I met a man in a bright white classroom, the darkest parts of my eyes turned into swirls, then question marks, then hearts. So we got married and went hippity hoppity splat, a mountain, a lake, a desert. We bought a house, a tiny one at first and then a massive one. A baby knocked at the door one night, didn't come in, and then another baby came. He cried a lot. We thought he had a tummy ache. We gave him a bath in a bucket. He was just lonely for his sister to come and keep him company, but you were still floating about in space inside your bubble egg. It had accessories, a switch for going sideways, a switch for going upside down or faster. It was a cross between a sparkly green and a sparkly silver. The moon was very annoying, and then whenever we'd all been bored on our own for long enough, down you came on a path of lightning to finish off the family. You were born on the living room floor at 3 a.m. in front of the trampoline sofa, and I heard them say, "A girl," and sat up straight away. We were both pretty, and I opened out my arms, and that's it, really. When you grow up, I'm going to be so busy taking you to the house shop, waiting by the playground gates to bring your children swimming. I won't be any different. I'll keep your room exactly as it is for you to visit. Bric-a-brac collection on the shelf, the bed your father built, the letters of your name in neon appearing on the ceiling when it's time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. Thanks for that delightful selection of poems. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed those. And if they're tuning in late, just to remind you that you can see this again on our Vimeo, vimeo.com/Ovale, or on our YouTube account if you'd like to go back and see these lovely readings again. It's actually an absolutely brilliant set, and I'm thrilled to be able to present it. So I just have a couple of questions for each of you, if that's okay, just to round off this event. So the first of those is I'd like to get a little bit of insight, if possible, into how the idea for your latest collection came about, and what maybe was the most difficult part of that process. I suppose for you, Jean, in your case as a translator, perhaps what was it about Volker von Törne's writing that induced you to translate it, and what did you find to be the most difficult part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't. Von Törne isn't the most recent one I've translated, but trying to think why I translated him. I mean, I think it comes from you first read, how shall I put this? You don't read the poetry and think, this is something I could translate. Well, I don't. You read the poetry and you think, oh yeah, this is really, really good poetry. And you get caught up in it. And then somehow it starts to translate itself. I think if you translate a lot, that's what happens. It starts to translate itself. You start to imagine what it would sound like in English. So when you realize that's happening, then you start translating it. So some things just don't seem to start translating themselves. As for what is particularly difficult about this poetry, I think it's possibly the use of sort of stock phrases and idioms in German, which would be recognizable in German as particular colloquial expressions or idioms. What do you do with them in English if we don't have quite the same expression? And of course, that raises a whole lot of questions about, do we want the reader to read it as German? Or do we want the reader to read it as some kind of equivalent English? I mean, I know what I think translation should be, which is to see what the original was doing, but that isn't necessarily the only way of doing it. So that for me is the challenge about this sort of poetry.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you. Mary, perhaps can we go on to you?
Yeah. They're all difficult. I think the question for this particular book, knowing when it was finished, was more difficult and comfortable.
So you're okay. That's good.
Rebecca, I think for this particular book, the last book, probably knowing when it was finished was a little more difficult, because the most essential poem for me, necessarily for the reader, I find that every book has a poem which, when written, I know that the book is nearly done, and this one came very, very late. So. And when that poem is written, there's a particular arc, if you like, that happens in the writing, in the process. I did wonder, why don't you just decide you write, 21 love poems or 14 sonnets or whatever? It has to be easier than this.
Could I interrupt you very briefly and ask you to just repeat the first part of that again? We lost your audio, but you're back now. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Just in this particular book, I think I tend to have one or two poems in every book, which are effectively, once they're written, I sort of know that I'm going towards the finish. It's also easier for me to choose what to leave out after that, because generally I have a lot more poems than I put into any given book. But that essential poem came at the very end in this case. It was probably the last poem written in the book, and that's not always the case at all. So I found that a bit difficult, because it meant I could have published the book a lot sooner, but I didn't want to till I had this one essential poem, which actually, as it happens now, is the first poem in the book, in fact. And it set a certain context for me, if not for the reader. A certain balance that I didn't want to give in a manuscript without that particular balance. That's a bit abstract, but there it is. And that poem was Gaudent Angeli. It was the poem about my grandson, in fact. About my farmer.
The Gaudent Angeli is the angels rejoice, isn't it? From a hymn,
it's
is
from
it?
A medieval hymn, yeah. Angels rejoice, and it always struck me during writing this book altogether. It's very counterintuitive for me to put anything, a word like rejoice in the title, or praise. It could be angels be praised. And I thought, no, I don't do enough of that. I'd like to write some praise poetry. I mean, there's a very good tradition of praise poetry and praise songs. And there are actually 2 praise poems in the book, which is as many probably as I'll write in quite a while. I was just focusing on, I think when you're at the third generation, the next generation stage, you have the children and then the grandchildren arrive, and it's as if the entire world is renewed for you all over again. At least that's what I felt. And maybe that's why I could look at those poems now.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Thank you. Sinead?
So Mary's just mentioned the word balance and getting that balance right. And my last collection was actually on balance, which is, this feels ages old to me now. But I haven't got another one. With no prospect of a new one in sight for a while either. But yeah, so On Balance was unusual for me in that I didn't do the normal, write some poems and then at some point it kind of coalesces and then you get your title and then you write to the finish line, as Mary was describing that process. It was completely different in that I got the title first. So I knew I wanted to write a book called On Balance, and I knew what I wanted it to be about, but I hadn't got any language, I hadn't got any individual poems. I kind of knew on a sub-linguistic level what I wanted the book to be about, which was about kind of gravity and balance and poetic form.
Well, fantastic. I think, is it Paul Durkin? He's the other poet I know who comes up with the title first and then creates the poem from the title. There aren't many people I know who do that. Thank you for that. Maybe. Well, it'll probably never happen to me again.
I am listening, but I'm not getting another title.
I'm sure one will come soon enough. I'm sure it'll come soon enough. And we're looking forward to your next collection too, of course, when it does come. Thank you. Maybe for the second question, I could start with you and we can work our way back to Jean, if that's okay. Kind of a general question about, sharing a touchstone poem. I'm always interested in people's touchstone poems. Your reason for it being a touchstone poem, one of them, of course, and whether it has influenced or inspired any of your own work.
Can someone else go first? Because I need to have a think about that, actually. Sorry.
I really put you on the spot with that, didn't I? I'm sorry, Sinead. Is there anyone who would like to weigh in on a touchstone poem?
I don't mind. I'm happy to say
something.
All
right, Jean. Okay, please. Thank you.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is a poem by Thomas Hardy called "The Voice," and it's a poem in which he addresses his wife, who by then his first wife, who by then has died, and I've always particularly liked this poem, partly because of its rhythm. It starts off, many people will know this poem. It starts off, woman much missed, how you call to me, saying that now you were not as you were when you had changed, and so on. And it's got this very particular rhythm. And it's a poem it's called The Voice, and it's a poem about the sound of somebody, about somebody calling, and how somebody calling means that you have to move towards them. And when the reason I picked that poem is because when I was translating the poetry of Paul Celan, the German-speaking poet who was born in Romania, he's got a very famous poem called Todesfuge, and in a very well-known translation by Michael Hamburger, it goes, "Black milk of morning, we drink you at evening," and so on and so on. And when I have also translated that poem, and for me that is very much it takes the rhythm of Hardy's poem, and I'm pretty sure that this was intentional. And what I really like about that is that you can, when you read the poem by Paul Celan in the original language, in German, you can hear Hardy kind of speaking through that poem. So, I'd already been very fond of this poem by Hardy before, and then being able to read something else and thinking, yeah, he was obviously influenced by this poem. You can really hear it. And when you translate it, you kind of fall into that rhythm automatically. So I would say that that's been a really important poem for me.
Super. Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks very much, Jean. Mary, we come to you.
Well, again, I'm stumped, and there are several, but there's one I've been going back to for a long, long time, and it is, especially at in-between times, because the last thing you want to do is be influenced by Yeats directly on have him sneaking onto your page, or any version of him. But it is all of Yeats really, but I I just dip into him every so often, but in particular the circus animals' desertion. I just find that rich and wonderful, and I think it is particularly for the ending. So anyone who can't remember the ending should go back and read it now. It's both true, and also it's got a cooler tone, I think, than a lot of Yeats poems, which I love. And so I go back to that a lot. But if I can have a second poem, it is Patrick Kavanagh's Exile. Sorry, what am I talking about? Patrick Kavanagh's Epic. It's short. Patrick Kavanagh's Epic, his poem Epic. It's short, and it is one of the most brilliant lessons in how to read the classics and how the classics are relevant to us at each age and at each stage of our lives. By the classics, I'm talking any classics, but he's talking specifically, I suppose, about the Greeks. And I use it a lot for teaching for that reason, but I also love reading it aloud. It's a beautiful poem.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Mary. Maybe Sinead?
Yeah, I've had a think now. Such lovely poems suggested there. The touchstone poem for me is a poem by Ciaran Carson, who of course passed away so sadly in October last year. And I would pick, so much of his work, he was such an absolutely brilliant writer in poetry and in prose. But and incidentally, Jean, a poet who was fascinated by Celan and who read him and, tried to work out Celan's syntax, particularly in a very impassioned way. We had some fantastic conversations about Celan. But the poem I would pick by Ciaran would be his poem Snow, which in turn is in conversation with Louis MacNeice's great poem Snow. And it transplants the key insight of that Louis MacNeice poem about life being, suddenly various in ways we can't really understand or encompass. Into Ciaran Carson's distinctive long line narrative style of Belfast Confetti of that collection, and just putting in all the bits and pieces of his life into the rich mosaic of this long-lined, masterful poem. At one point, he talks about all the bits and pieces that are found down the backs of sofas. The haberdashery of loss is how he describes it. And I just think it's a brilliant poem in and of itself. It's a brilliant poem because it's in conversation with another poem. And it's just a masterful balance, to use that word again, of hospitality to other writers and other sources, and absolute truth to his own life as lived in those Belfast streets and as determined by his own particular Ciaran-esque obsessions and preoccupations.
Wow, that's a great answer too. Thank you so much. Thank you all really for those nuggets. I think we got more than our money's worth tonight. So again, I'd like to thank you all for taking part in the festival, for your fantastic readings, which I'm going to be able to enjoy even more once I watch them again, because half my head is in the technical stuff here. But I just would like to also thank our internet guests for viewing us live, and if you have any couple of pennies to spare, we have a donation button up above our festival stage. Any couple of pennies will always help, and we're very grateful for that. But please catch some of our other events. We have our Rachel Hegarty and John McCullough, Chris Mansell from Australia coming up in just under an hour's time from now, and we've got loads of amazing events on over the next couple of days, so please try and catch some of those. And thank you very much once again, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.